Yeah, bro, if I do normal parallel squats, they destroy my knees. So instead, I do sliding knee quarter squats with twice as much weight, and my knees feel fine. That's cap. Chest up, shoulders back. Welcome to Revival Fitness, everybody, your home for gains and brains. And today I present to you the full tactical guide on how to prevent yourself from ego lifting. So ego lifting is basically the day trading of the gym. It's a bunch of dudes obsessed with big flashy numbers in the short term, despite having no real plan in the long term. Ego lifting is a rite of passage for gym goers. Nobody's immune to it, even the most seasoned lifters among us. I still succumb to the ego myself. Nobody is above this happening from time to time. But you do want to make this far less frequent and really not make it a habit if you're doing it right now. And because a lot of you watching are novices, you might not be able to accept this yet or admit this to yourself, but you do ego lift. It's extremely common, and the guys who say they don't do it oftentimes do it the most. And the human ego is one heck of a fighter. It wins more often than it loses. So here is how to defend yourself. So the first and one of the most essential tips here: never count reps that require the assistance of a spotter. I don't care if they just grazed the bar with their pinky, it does not count. And I'm being a bit facetious with the pinky grazing the bar example, but this gets way out of control in most commercial gyms. You'll commonly see guys, what do they always say? Oh, you bro.
One more! You got one more! Oh, you, yeah!
The spotter's doing just as much, often more work than the lifter themselves. All you. And then they'll count those reps as if they're legitimate. I saw this recently at my gym. I think this was a couple months ago. There was a dude on the bench, two younger guys, probably 16, 18 years old. The dude benching could not cleanly get up 135 for a single rep. I watched him lower it, and then it stuck to his chest. Then his friend takes over. Oh, you bro. They proceed to crank out 10 reps with 135, in which the lifter couldn't do one by himself. He gets up off the bench, they high five, and he says, I finally got 10. Listen guys, you're more than welcome to cope all you want when it comes to this topic, but this is reality. The guys who train like that, especially over and over and over, they stay stuck in novice purgatory. They stay small and weak. There is no logical reason to count spotter-assisted reps. And if you're in the comments right now arguing with me about this, that's just another clear sign that you're controlled by your ego, because there is no justification for this behavior. And especially whenever you have a spotter with you, there's no easier time to succumb to your ego and get in this competitive mode. If you're about to fail the bench press, yeah, your spotter can help you, okay? They might be able to give you some cues, things of that nature. But if you have a spotter, guys, who's very handsy, they're always touching the bar, touching your arms, whatever, if they're always interfering in your sets, you need to get rid of them. Okay, I'm not saying you need to just train by yourself and be a monk in a home gym for the rest of your life, but spotters like this will rob you of years of progress. So whether you're getting a spotter assist for the entire set from a gym bro or just one last rep from a random guy walking by, those do not count in your logbook. If you're counting those reps now, stop it before you never get out of this bad habit. So the second tip to avoid ego lifting: adhere to the full range of motion. And this concept has become much more popular in recent years than it was even 5 to 10 years ago, but you'll still see some popular lifters half rep almost everything they do. And once again, their justifications for doing this are very faulty. So let's take a minute, guys. Forget all of the evidence-based, science-based content that's just saturated these platforms, all the big words, all of the PubMed articles you pretend that you read. We know you don't. Forget all of that for a second. Just use your common sense, put on your thinking cap. The further you take a given range of motion, the further those muscles involved have to stretch. This is something you can intuitively figure out with your own body and senses, right? Say you're gonna do a bench press, bring your arms out, bring them halfway down. Feel your chest. Then bring the arms back farther. You can literally feel the chest stretching. And the same can apply to any muscle. This is intuitive to figure out. You don't need all of this data, all of these numbers, all this research. This is basic stuff here. Now, however, this is not to say that an extended range of motion is always better. Ass to grass squats, for example, can inevitably lead to butt wink and low back pain. Going very low on dips could lead to potential shoulder pain and injury, especially if you drop down very far. Doing something like a deficit deadlift could put so much torque on your lower back that the entire movement simply isn't worth it. Or maybe you even have something like an old shoulder injury or inflammation, and doing strict dead hang pull-ups or chin-ups can inflame that for you, which you want to avoid. I've said that before, guys. This is going to vary based on the person, and you don't always have to extend ranges of motion to their fullest potential, so to speak. With that said, though, if you cannot perform basic standard ROMs, okay, a squat to parallel, a bench press to your chest, extending your arms on pull-ups or chin-ups, if you cannot do those basic functions without pain, you're the problem. If you cannot lower a bench press bar to your chest without serious shoulder pain or inflammation or something, your form sucks. And if your form somehow doesn't suck, which it more than likely does, then in that case, you have a serious shoulder issue that's gonna require time off from the gym. And it's funny too, because the same guys who claim that a standard range of motion destroys their joints and their tendons, they're often the same ones who will load up 2 to 3 times more weight on the bar or the dumbbells than they could normally do through the full range, but that somehow does not bother their joints. Right, if they bench 185 all the way to their chest, oh man, that destroys my shoulder, bro. Then they're benching 275 halfway, and their shoulders are somehow fine. Yeah, bro, if I do normal parallel squats, they destroy my knees. So instead, I do sliding knee quarter squats with twice as much weight, and my knees feel fine. That's cap. But I like to shorten the range of motion to target my blank on this exercise. I want to target my chest on the bench press, so I do half reps. It's not ego lifting, it's specifically targeting. No, it's not. That doesn't even make sense. Now, you can shift emphasis on certain muscles based on equipment, maybe angles, foot position, hand position, things of that nature. But fundamentally, on a multi-joint movement, you cannot isolate or specifically target one single muscle. That's why it's a multi-joint movement. This notion that you can somehow directly isolate the quads when squatting or the pecs when benching is so dumb it defies an explanation. Really, it's unbelievable. It's essentially like saying that you're going to remove the jelly out of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich after you've made the sandwich. All you're gonna do is make a mess and make a fool of yourself. So it's not the exercise's fault that you're just dumb. By adhering to a standard or full range of motion, you're inherently less likely to ego lift because the weight has to be lower comparatively by default. And by doing this too, you also decrease risk of injury, because if you go through a full range of motion, you get the full mobility benefits and the strength benefits concurrently. It's very common for guys who half rep movements that one day they go for a little bit more weight than they can handle, right? They go to that sticking point, they can't get it up, their muscles have no mobility through that range, then they snap themselves up. So on top of all of that too, you're simply going to teach yourself to make progress at a more reasonable rate, because going through the full range means a longer distance, and longer distances when it comes to lifting, guys, even something like 2 to 3 extra inches makes a big difference in your total output. And I can attest to this too, man. I tell you guys all the time, I've made all these mistakes. When I was in novice purgatory, whenever I was newer to the gym, I coped as well on the bench press. I wanted more than anything to bench 185. I never could do it, so what did I do? I would half rep it and say, oh, well, you know, the bench doesn't work my chest, bro. It's bad for the shoulders, right? I would do that, and I would kind of get a little bit more, maybe at +5 every now and then. Still couldn't cleanly bench 185, still had a flat chest, It's nothing but cope. And if you're somebody who does have a hard time judging full range of motion, especially a lot of beginners, they can have trouble with this. Take squats, for example. There are ways you can ensure you hit a consistent range of motion each time. So if you're doing back squats or front squats, you can place a plyometric box underneath you, maybe an upright dumbbell, something like that. By setting that there, you have a consistent gauge of hitting the same range of motion every single time. And this is very common for guys, especially when deep into sets of squats. The range of motion will start to go up and up and up. This happens with the bench press too, also rows, really every exercise, right? So rep 5 is here. Rep 6, a little bit higher, 7, a little bit higher. By the final rep, they're essentially doing half or quarter reps, but they don't realize it because they're so kind of lost in the moment of the exercise. Also, that's why you got to record yourselves. Quick side note there. So unless you are specifically doing an exercise with a partial range of motion as a movement, right? Something like block deadlifts, maybe higher box squats, a pin press or a block press for a bench press, something like that. Unless you're doing those, there is no reason to artificially shorten the ROM. So don't do that. And we have 2 more areas to cover. But before we do so, ladies and gentlemen, it's the algorithm. Now, moving on to tip number 3 to avoid ego lifting. Control the eccentric. So if you're newer to the gym, guys, or not familiar with the terminology, the eccentric phase of a lift is the lowering portion, and the concentric is the raising or positive portion. And aside from exercises done specifically from dead stops on the floor, more power-based exercises like, say, pendlay rows, conventional deadlifts, or Olympic lifting, pretty much every single exercise is going to benefit from some level of a controlled eccentric. Now, this does not mean to do time under tension brah and do your slow motion 5-second negatives. Okay, I don't care what all these skinny 150-pound athlean X fanboys try to say in the comments. There is no benefit, guys, to milking your rep speed into real-time slow motion. That does absolutely nothing for you. There's no hypertrophic benefits to that. You're going to lose a strength by doing that, and you're simply just going to waste time in the gym. That is completely illogical. There's no reason to do it. If you're doing it now because you saw some bodybuilder do it, please stop. If you want a more in-depth video on rep speed and the eccentric and the concentric, click the video in the top corner. I'll break that down there for you. But going forward on controlling the eccentric, assuming you're not just turning your reps into this real-time slow motion nonsense, if you take a nice second or two to control your weight on the way down, you're going to reduce the risk of ego lifting, of injury, and you're ultimately going to give yourself more gains. And the encompassing reason for this is simple. You're in full control of the weight. A trend you're going to notice with ego lifters, no matter what gym, what exercise, what equipment, what do they almost always do every single time? They rush through the eccentric. They dive bomb the weight on the bench press and then they hip thrust it up. They bounce their deadlifts off the floor and then they cat back them up with momentum. They do their CrossFit style pull-ups and they swing on the bar to get more reps, all of this type of thing. In these instances, they are relying too much on momentum to complete the reps, not their own strength. Now, of course, some level of momentum is to be expected when lifting, but as a general rule, you do not want to be relying on momentum, especially over and over in your training. So the whole point of lifting weights, aka resistance training, is to train against resistance. And the easier you make this task via bouncing, momentum, jerking, shifting, etc., the less work your muscles actually have to do, even if on paper they're doing more work because of the increased weight. And once again, we have to talk about the injury risk here, because if you're always rushing through your eccentrics, you're never in full control. Your muscles, your joints, your tendons, your bracing, your breathing, your stabilization. None of those things get the chance to fully hit their peak form, so to speak. You never can fully lock into the movement and control the weight. That's going to once again increase the likelihood of you being injured. And one quick tip here before we move on to the final point. I want to make this note about dumbbell presses because I have kind of conflicted with this myself. I've seen other people do this too. This is what I like to do when it comes to dumbbell presses now. I like to only count reps starting from an eccentric into a concentric position. Let me explain. So guys will commonly thrust their dumbbells up for shoulder presses or chest presses, and they'll count that as one, right? They'll kick them up, one. I don't like to do that myself because once again, you're starting from a position of some momentum usage and external help. Once again, especially if you have a spotter. So for a bench press, you're going to unrack it, do the eccentric and then the concentric. So for a dumbbell press, get the dumbbells up in position. Once they're there, you lower them down, press them up. That is your first rep, not merely getting them up into position. And now the final way to prevent yourself from ego lifting, and this is gonna anger some of the guys, but it's true. Stop taking everything to failure, especially among novice lifters who watch all these bodybuilders go beast mode ape shit on the internet all day. They think you have to take every single exercise, even the heaviest compound movements, to failure to see results. And that's simply not the case, and that tendency and that mentality often lead them into the path of ego lifting. And this is something I also can struggle with, especially on upper body movements. I think particularly as guys, most of us will leave a rep or two in the tank on leg training, just because leg training, assuming you do it through a good range of motion and all the stuff we just talked about, assuming you do that, leg training is just exhausting, right? You have a rep in the tank, you're like, okay, that's fine. But as dudes, chest training, back training, shoulder training, there can be a heavy tendency to push it all the way to death struggle failure. You're straining under the weight, you're shaking, you're shimmying, your body's telling you, hey man, time to kind of cut this here. You won't do it. Something else that gets overlooked as well, even if you never get injured, taking things to absolute failure, even if you train completely by yourself, taking things to absolute failure heightens your overall fatigue, which is going to make it harder to recover on a session-by-session basis. So no matter how you look at this, taking everything to absolute failure has a lot of drawbacks on the back end, even if in the moment it looks really cool and stuff. Now once again, oh, but this bodybuilder did it. Yeah, and he's on, what, 3 grams of gear, 5 grams of gear, a bunch of tren, a bunch of other stuff. Are you on all those things? So I'm not saying taking things to failure is automatically bad, especially the more single joint movements, curls, lateral raises, abs. Yeah, take those to failure all you want. But for most of your training, which I encourage the bulk of your training to be multi-joint movements, I think the sweet spot is roughly 1 RIR, maybe 2 RIR, or reps in reserve. Some guys are going to gauge this via RPE. I think RIR is a bit better simply because talking tangibly how many reps you believe you had left is more feasible than perceived exertion. So if you combine all of these factors, guys, we discussed in this video, if you button up your training, if you get your ego in check, you're going to make more gains than you ever have before, and you're going to stay safer while doing so. So this has been the video, guys. Thank you as always for watching. Big shout out as always to the Patreon supporters and the channel members. Hit me up for custom coaching programs and consultations in the links down below. Check out some of my sponsors as well. Haha, I know you guys don't like that one, do you? And stay tuned for more future videos and in-depth training discussions. And I will catch you next time.